I agree. Um, Talking about other metrics, right? For example, MAPE, MACE, and RMSE. Some people say that they are considered inadequate. Of course, the general public, understands only MAPE, at least in my field of market mix modeling. So we have to go with it, even though I can supply with them even with more robust metrics. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think MAPE or MACE or RMSE are inadequate? Are there better alternatives?
Actually, I have a couple of paper on that, which we'll
Okay.
link in the description later on. And this is one of the things where I might part ways with other forecasters because I have very strong opinions on error measures, and it's a bit of
Hmm.
a hobby horse for me. Problem is, so MAPE, mean absolute percentage error. It's
Hmm.
something that can give to a manager who doesn't do forecasting. They understand what the percentage is, they
Yeah.
understand what the mean percentage error is, and that's fine. The problem is, and it also works well on all the time series that you see in tutorials
Yeah.
or textbooks and so on, because they're typically have very high signal, like the airline data set. You actually see the trend, you see the seasonality, and it's very easy to forecast. And you can do MAPE, and it's not misleading, and it's all very good, and that's fine. People learn from that, and then they apply their knowledge to other time series that are much messier. And especially when you come to low volume time series with a high coefficient of variation. So
Hmm.
the standard deviation of the time series is high compared to the mean. And then you suddenly find interesting effects, especially of the MAPE. So if your time series actually contains zeros, for instance, if you have intermittent demand, you sell a product and in some time buckets it simply didn't sell anything, then your MAPE explodes because you're just trying to divide by zero because you have an error and try to express that as a percentage of the true zero sales. You're dividing by zero. It's undefined. People are unhappy. Okay, so you do some kind of change to that. But even if you don't have zeros, I like to say you just take a standard six-sided die and roll that and forecast that. Okay, so you get 1 to 6, all with equal probability. So the expectation is 3.5, and that would probably be the best forecast. But if you look at the MAPE, I actually can't put together what the optimal forecast is. But if you want to minimize the MAPE, if your bonus is tied to getting a low MAPE on this particular time series, then you're incentivized not to forecast 3.5. You're incentivized to forecast something like 4, I think.
Hmm.
Why? If you forecast a 2, for instance, then your error below is bounded by 50% because you can not go below 1 in your rolling of the dice, and 1 is a 50% error. But if you just forecast a 2 and you roll a 6, then you have an error of 4, and that's
Hmm.
200%. So
Yeah.
under forecasting is penalized more strongly than over forecasting, and that incentivizes you to give a higher forecast than the expectation. And so if you really want the expectation of your time series to be forecasted, then using the MAPE as a quality measure could send the wrong signal and incentivize you to give a biased forecast. And I know of people who will take the forecast and know that they're being measured by MAPE, and they just change the forecast ex post. So I have a forecast that their methodology, their software gives them and says this is an expectation forecast, and they know, well, I'm being measured by MAPE. I'm going to change my forecast. And the same happens to the MASE, which is the mean absolute scaled error. And that's the scaling of the mean absolute error. And that actually elicits or rewards you forecasting the conditional median of your data generating process. And again, look at intermittent demands. If half of your time periods don't have any demand, then by definition, the median of the predictive distribution is zero. And so if you want to optimize the MAIS or MAE, then you want to output a flat zero forecast. And there were a couple of years back, there were lots of papers in intermittent demand forecasting, and they all found that the flat zero forecast was best and better than the method they were proposing. And they had to, again, tie themselves into pretzels to explain why their proposed method was still better than the flat zero forecast, even if the flat zero forecast looked best. It looked best because people were using the mean absolute error. And that simply doesn't incentivize you to give an unbiased expectation forecast.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at the entire discussion in the context of quantile forecasting, quantile forecasts can be assessed using the pinball loss. And that is a completely different thing than RMSE and so on. And of course, everybody understands that you do not want to use a 90%, take 90% quantile forecast and assess it using the MAPE or the RMSE. Although, aside, I have seen big name management consultants do exactly that. Take a quantile forecast and assess it using the MAPE. Ghastly. Okay. And people understand that the pinball loss is something different than the RMSE. And so you just need to extend that thinking to understanding that RMSE, MAE, MSE, MAPE, they are again all different things. And I personally like to say, you should first understand here's my time series, which functional of the time series do I want to forecast? Do I want to forecast a quantile? Do I want to forecast a conditional expectation? Do I forecast something else? Now I know the functional. Now I can say which error measure is the correct one. Should I be using the pinball loss because I want to elicit a quantile forecast? Should I be using the RMSE because I want to elicit the expectation? And to be honest, I've never seen a use case where I would want to optimize the MAPE in terms of this being the forecast that gives me the best business decisions later on. The MAPE is good to communicate to non-technical people, but it can be horribly misleading. And I always try to invest in educating people to understand the drawbacks of the MAPE. We're going to have another link in the description later on.
Yeah,